Think about the worst decision you've ever made while angry, exhausted, sick, or under pressure. Now imagine that nobody around you can simply tell you to go home, sleep it off, and try again tomorrow. You have armies. You control land. Your family is constantly watching the throne. Foreign rulers are waiting for weakness. Priests tell you that your authority comes from God. Nobles flatter you because offending you can ruin their lives. That was the psychological environment surrounding medieval kingship. And it creates a strange problem. When a ruler became paranoid, violently unstable, deeply depressed, confused, or completely detached from reality, where did personality end and illness begin? Was he actually mentally unwell? Was he reacting to constant war and betrayal? Was a physical disease affecting his brain? Or were his enemies simply calling him insane because they wanted his crown? The answer is messier than the stories about mad kings suggest, because medieval monarchy could magnify ordinary human weakness until one person's breakdown became an entire kingdom's emergency. The first thing to understand is that medieval people did recognize severe changes in behavior. They simply didn't organize them using modern psychiatric categories. Learned physicians inherited medical traditions that described conditions such as mania, melancholy, frenzy, and delirium. Humoral medicine explained health through the balance of bodily fluids and qualities such as heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Depending on the symptoms, treatment might involve diet, rest, bathing, medication, bloodletting, changes in environment, or efforts to calm the patient. Outside learned medicine, explanations could become much broader. A person behaving strangely might be considered feverish, melancholic, spiritually troubled, punished by God, influenced by supernatural forces, overwhelmed by grief, or simply suffering from some physical disease nobody could identify. These explanations could overlap. Medieval people did not necessarily choose one and reject all the others. That makes diagnosing a king 700 years later extremely risky. We don't have psychiatric interviews. We don't have brain scans. We rarely have detailed medical records. What we usually have are chronicles, letters, administrative documents, diplomatic reports, and stories written by people who had political and religious reasons for describing a ruler in a particular way. And there is another huge distortion. Kings were watched. If a farmer became confused for several months, almost nobody recorded it. If the king stopped recognizing his wife, refused to speak, attacked members of his household, or became unable to govern, people wrote about it because government itself had suddenly developed a problem. Royal mental illness therefore looks unusually common, partly because royal lives are unusually visible. Still, some cases are far too substantial to dismiss as gossip. The clearest is Charles VI of France. Charles became king in 1380, when he was only 11 years old. His kingdom was already complicated. France was fighting the long conflict we now call the 100 Years' War. Powerful nobles controlled enormous territories. Royal relatives competed for money, offices, and influence. The monarchy sat at the center of a political network in which almost everyone important had their own followers and their own ambitions. Charles eventually began exercising power personally, and, during his early reign, was capable enough to earn favorable descriptions. Then came 1392. Charles was traveling with an army when his behavior changed dramatically. He had reportedly been physically unwell beforehand. During the expedition, he suddenly drew his weapon and attacked members of his own entourage. Several men were killed before he could be restrained. This was something different from the violence expected of a medieval warrior king. Charles wasn't fighting an enemy on a battlefield. He had turned against his own companions. Afterward, he suffered a major collapse, and it did not remain an isolated event. For roughly the next 3 decades, Charles experienced recurring periods of severe mental disturbance, interrupted by periods of greater lucidity. At times, he could participate in government and court life. At others, surviving descriptions portray him as confused, withdrawn, unable to recognize people close to him, or behaving in ways his household considered completely detached from reality. The most famous story claims that Charles sometimes believed his body was made of glass, and feared that physical contact could shatter him. Later accounts even describe attempts to protect his clothing with reinforcing pieces. That specific detail has become almost inseparable from his reputation, although historians have to treat colorful anecdotes more carefully than the broader evidence of his recurring incapacity. What is much harder to dispute is what happened politically. France had a king who sometimes could not rule. Today, many governments have formal mechanisms for transferring authority when a leader becomes incapacitated. There are written procedures, deputies, constitutional rules, medical evaluations, bureaucracies, and enough legal language to make almost any crisis painfully procedural. Medieval France had powerful relatives, and powerful relatives are rarely procedural. When Charles could not govern, authority moved toward the people around him. His brother Louis, Duke of Orléans, became increasingly important. So did the king's cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Their rivalry was not caused entirely by Charles's illness. These men had their own territories, resources, supporters, and political interests. But an intermittently incapacitated king created an enormous prize. Control access to Charles, and you could influence royal government. The rivalry eventually became murderous. In 1407, Louis of Orléans was assassinated by men acting on John the Fearless's orders. France descended deeper into factional conflict between Burgundians and their opponents, eventually associated with the Armagnac faction. Meanwhile, England had not forgotten that France was vulnerable. Henry V renewed English campaigns and won the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Charles's illness did not single-handedly produce France's political disasters. That would be much too simple. War, noble rivalry, taxation, regional interests, dynastic claims, and military setbacks all mattered. But his condition exposed one of the great weaknesses of medieval monarchy. The crown might be an institution. The institution was still attached to a person. And if that person could not function, everyone had to decide who was allowed to function for him. Which brings us back to the strange contradiction at the center of royal life. Kings had enormous advantages. They ate better than most people. They lived in protected residences. They could summon physicians. They had servants, money, horses, expensive clothing, and access to treatments unavailable to almost everyone below the elite. If material comfort protected anyone from medieval hardship, surely it should have protected them. Except kingship created its own pressures. A royal child could become politically important before understanding what politics even was. Marriage plans might be discussed while that child was still young. Tutors were chosen carefully. Household appointments mattered. Friendships mattered. Every influential adult nearby could represent a faction. And sometimes a child inherited everything. Henry VI of England became king when he was less than 1 year old. His father, Henry V, died in 1422 after building an extraordinary military reputation and placing England in an unusually powerful position in France. The crown now belonged to a baby. Obviously, Henry did not govern England from a cradle. Councils and adult relatives governed around him. But his childhood shows how strange hereditary monarchy could become. The political system did not select the person best prepared to handle war, administration, diplomacy, and noble rivalry. It selected the correct bloodline. Then everyone hoped the human being attached to that bloodline could do the job. Henry grew into a very different ruler from his father. He was notably religious and showed little of Henry V's enthusiasm for aggressive military kingship. His reign became associated with poor government, factional disputes, military losses in France, and increasingly dangerous competition among English nobles. Some criticism came from enemies and must be treated accordingly. Then, in 1453, Henry suffered a dramatic period of incapacity. For months, he appears to have become largely unresponsive. Accounts describe a man who barely reacted to the people around him. Even the birth of his son Edward apparently produced little meaningful response. For a hereditary monarchy, this was terrifying. The king was alive. The king was physically present, but government still needed someone else. Richard, Duke of York, eventually became protector of the realm. Henry later recovered. The political consequences did not. During his incapacity, relationships had shifted. Offices had changed hands. Rival nobles had learned what government might look like without Henry effectively exercising authority. The tensions surrounding the monarchy eventually fed into the Wars of the Roses. Again, giving Henry a modern diagnosis would go beyond the evidence. Historians have proposed possibilities based on his symptoms, but we cannot know precisely what condition he suffered. There is, however, a family connection that makes the case especially interesting. Henry's maternal grandfather was Charles VI of France. That does not prove that Henry inherited the same condition. Human genetics is much more complicated than a family curse passing neatly from grandfather to grandson. Still, the relationship has understandably encouraged historians to consider whether some inherited vulnerability could have played a role alongside stress, physical health, and other unknown factors. And this is usually the point where somebody says, royal inbreeding. There is some truth buried inside the stereotype. Royal marriages were political tools. Dynasties married other dynasties because marriage could create alliances, settle disputes, strengthen claims to territory, produce heirs, or connect aristocratic families. That created a restricted social pool. Some royal spouses were related. Repeated marriages among relatives can increase the chance that harmful recessive genetic traits will appear in children. Certain dynasties, especially in later European history, became extreme examples of this. But turning that into the explanation for every unstable medieval monarch does not work. The medieval church maintained rules restricting marriage between relatives, although the exact degrees prohibited changed over time and dispensations could be granted. Royal families also married across kingdoms and enormous geographic distances. The extremely concentrated dynastic inbreeding associated with some famous early modern royal houses should not simply be projected backward onto every medieval king. Genetics may explain part of individual cases. It cannot explain the entire pattern. Royal stress gives us another piece. A medieval king could spend his life surrounded by threats that were not imaginary. Nobles rebelled. Relatives challenged succession. Foreign rulers supported rival claimants. Courtiers switched alliances. Assassination was possible. Civil war was possible. A failed military campaign could destroy years of political authority. If you are suspicious because 3 members of your extended family genuinely have armies and 2 of them have considered replacing you, modern ideas about paranoia become slightly harder to apply. Sometimes the people around the king really were plotting. The psychological problem is what happens when realistic suspicion becomes impossible to distinguish from pathological suspicion. Medieval kingship offered few opportunities to switch off. Travel was demanding. Campaigning could last months. Royal households moved constantly. Kings attended councils, heard petitions, negotiated disputes, performed religious obligations, managed nobles, raised money, arranged marriages, produced heirs, and maintained the elaborate public behavior expected of monarchy. Privacy existed, especially for elites, but a king could never become politically invisible. Even his bedroom mattered, because succession depended on what happened there. War added another danger: injury. Royal and aristocratic men rode horses, hunted, trained with weapons, fought in tournaments, and sometimes entered battle personally. Head injuries were entirely possible. We know today that traumatic brain injuries can affect personality, judgment, emotional regulation, memory, and behavior. That does not allow us to explain the behavior of any particular medieval king simply by announcing that he must have been hit in the head. Usually the evidence is nowhere near that clear. But it reminds us that madness was sometimes a label covering physical conditions medieval observers could not separate. High fever can produce delirium. Neurological illnesses can change behavior. Seizures can appear terrifying to observers unfamiliar with their cause. Certain infections can affect the brain. Medication itself could sometimes worsen a patient's condition. So a chronicle describing several days of bizarre behavior during a severe illness does not necessarily describe a lifelong psychiatric condition. And then there is another category altogether. Sometimes a king looked crazy because he could get away with behavior almost nobody today could. Medieval kings were not universally absolute rulers. Their authority was constrained by custom, nobles, finances, law, church institutions, assemblies, and practical reality. A king who ordered something impossible could still discover the medieval version of an unread email. Nobody did it. But successful rulers enjoyed enormous social permission. Anger could be public. Punishment could be spectacular. A ruler could imprison opponents, confiscate property under certain circumstances, humiliate enemies, wage destructive wars, and use violence in ways that would immediately destroy the legitimacy of most modern political leaders. Put some medieval kings into a modern workplace, and human resources would survive until approximately 1130. None of that requires mental illness. Cruelty is not automatically madness. Neither is arrogance. Neither is aggression. Neither is making catastrophically bad decisions. Power itself can produce behavior that looks irrational from outside, because the person holding it experiences consequences very differently from everyone else. There was also a cultural gap. Extreme religious devotion, fear of divine punishment, obsession with sacred relics, elaborate public penance, intense mourning, or concern with supernatural signs could all appear bizarre when removed from medieval context. For contemporaries, these behaviors could make perfect cultural sense. Then we have perhaps the most dangerous source of all, political enemies. Calling a ruler incapable has always been useful. If you want to resist a legitimate king, you need an explanation. Maybe he has evil advisors. Maybe he is a tyrant. Maybe he has violated law and custom. Or maybe he is simply incapable of ruling. Richard II of England shows how difficult this becomes. Richard was deposed in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard had alienated major nobles, pursued revenge against political opponents, centralized power around trusted followers, and made decisions that contributed to his downfall. Later descriptions sometimes portray him as deeply unstable, narcissistic, emotionally uncontrolled, or psychologically abnormal. Modern writers have occasionally tried to translate those descriptions into psychiatric diagnoses. The evidence cannot support that level of certainty. Richard may have been arrogant, he may have been vindictive, he certainly made political mistakes. But losing your throne has a remarkable effect on how future chroniclers describe your personality. The winner does not necessarily have to invent every accusation. Selection alone can reshape memory. Every angry episode becomes evidence. Every unusual decision becomes a symptom. Every conflict becomes proof that something was wrong with the man rather than with the political system around him. So whenever a medieval source describes a king as mad, we have to ask two separate questions. What did the ruler actually do, and who benefited from describing it that way? That distinction becomes even more important when stories grow more dramatic over time. Charles VI genuinely suffered recurring episodes of serious incapacity. That is well supported. Whether every famous anecdote told about his behavior happened exactly as later writers described it is another matter. The same problem appears outside Western Europe. The Byzantine Emperor Justin II, who ruled during the 6th century, experienced what contemporary accounts describe as a severe mental and behavioral collapse. John of Ephesus gives particularly vivid descriptions of Justin screaming, behaving violently, and becoming extraordinarily difficult for attendants to manage. Those reports strongly suggest that something serious occurred. They still are not a modern clinical record. The surviving evidence tells us much more securely that contemporaries saw alarming behavior than it tells us precisely what biological or psychiatric process caused it. For the court, the diagnosis was almost secondary anyway. The immediate question was what to do with a king who could not safely govern. At first, concealment could be attractive. Admitting that a monarch had become incapable might encourage rebellion, foreign invasion, or factional maneuvering. If recovery seemed possible, the people around him had a strong incentive to keep the royal machine operating while revealing as little weakness as possible. Documents could still be issued. Orders could still travel. Officials could continue working, Access to the king could be controlled. The real power might move quietly toward a queen, prince, council, favorite, or senior noble. This was the medieval political equivalent of insisting everything at the company is perfectly normal while nobody has seen the CEO for 6 weeks. Except several executives own castles. If incapacity continued, some formal arrangement became necessary. Regencies and protectorates could provide temporary government. But temporary authority creates an obvious problem. The person exercising power now has something worth keeping. Who appoints officials? Who controls the royal household? Who decides military policy? Who distributes land and offices? Who physically gets to see the king? Suddenly caring for an incapacitated monarch and controlling an incapacitated monarch can look suspiciously similar. And recovery did not automatically fix anything. When Charles VI regained periods of lucidity, the factions competing around him remained. When Henry VI recovered, Richard of York and his opponents did not forget what had happened while Henry was incapable. Power had already moved. That makes recurring illness especially destructive in a monarchy. Authority moves outward during the crisis. Then the king returns and tries to pull it back. Then another crisis begins. Everyone adjusts again. It is political whiplash with armed nobles. Religion made royal illness even more unsettling. Medieval kingship carried sacred meaning. Coronation ceremonies, anointing, religious oaths, royal patronage, and ideas about divinely sanctioned authority gave the monarch a position that went far beyond ordinary administration. The king was supposed to preserve justice and order. What did it mean if he could no longer control himself? Some contemporaries interpreted mental disturbance through divine punishment or spiritual danger. Others focused more heavily on bodily illness and humoral imbalance. Prayer and medical treatment could happen side by side without contradiction. Royal patients had access to some of the best care medieval society could provide. Physicians could alter diet, prescribe medications, recommend sleep, bathing, exercise, entertainment, quiet surroundings, or other attempts to rebalance body and mind. Attendants could try to keep a distressed ruler calm and physically safe. Some treatments were ineffective, others were actively dangerous, and some basic measures like rest, nutrition, reduced stimulation, and attentive care may have helped even when the explanation behind them was wrong. But there was an obvious limit. There were no antipsychotic medications. No modern mood stabilizers, no brain imaging, no psychiatric hospitals operating under modern standards, no reliable method for distinguishing severe depression from neurological illness, psychosis from delirium, or psychiatric symptoms from infection. A royal household could restrain a king, hide him, comfort him, medicate him, pray for him, govern around him, and wait. That helplessness is part of what made royal madness so disturbing. Medieval monarchies surrounded rulers with extraordinary symbolism. Their portraits appeared on seals and coins. Ceremonies emphasized legitimacy. Subjects swore loyalty. Officials acted in the king's name across territories the monarch might never personally visit. Yet all of that authority eventually returned to something incredibly fragile: a human body, a human brain. And there is a final twist. During the later Middle Ages, European kingdoms were becoming increasingly capable of governing through institutions rather than through the king's direct presence. Royal chancelleries produced documents, financial administrations collected revenue, courts handled disputes, councils advised rulers, professional clerks preserved records. In theory, that should have reduced the danger of an incapacitated monarch. Instead, it often changed the form of the crisis. The paperwork could continue. Someone still had to authorize it. Who controlled the royal seal? Whose orders represented the king's will? Could a council make major decisions without him? Could his wife, his brother, his uncle, his heir? And what happened when two of those people disagreed? Modern governments usually try to answer those questions before a crisis occurs. Medieval governments often discovered the answer while the crisis was already happening. So were medieval kings unusually crazy? There is no evidence that wearing a crown somehow made medieval rulers collectively more prone to mental illness than everyone else. What kings had was visibility, extraordinary pressure, unusual family structures, frequent exposure to war and physical illness, and an enormous amount of power attached to their personal behavior. Some genuinely became severely mentally unwell. Some may have had inherited vulnerabilities. Some probably suffered neurological or physical diseases that observers interpreted as madness. Some reacted badly to trauma and pressure. Some were violent because their political culture tolerated violence. Some were simply terrible rulers, and some acquired reputations for insanity because the people replacing them needed a convincing explanation for why replacement was necessary. The crown magnified all of it. Your worst week might damage a relationship, ruin a project, or make you regret several conversations. A medieval king's worst week could change who controlled a government. His family argument could become a civil war. His period of confusion could strengthen a rival dynasty. His illness could encourage an invasion. His inability to recognize the people around him could determine which prince gained access to royal power. That is why figures such as Charles VI and Henry VI remain so memorable. Their illness did not stay inside a bedroom. It spread outward through the political systems built around them. Today, many states are deliberately designed around the idea that the person at the top is replaceable. Presidents, prime ministers, ministers, judges, civil servants, legislatures, and bureaucracies operate through rules intended to keep government functioning when individuals leave, die, resign, lose elections, or become incapable of working. Those systems can still fail, but the office is supposed to survive the person. Medieval monarchy never completely solved that separation. A king could possess councils, officials, courts, archives, treasuries, and armies, yet the legitimacy holding those pieces together still depended heavily on him. Which takes us back to that first uncomfortable thought. Picture yourself exhausted, frightened, physically ill, surrounded by people whose loyalty you cannot completely trust, and expected to make decisions affecting thousands of lives. Now remove the doctor who understands modern mental illness. Remove the constitutional procedure that temporarily replaces you. Remove the institution powerful enough to tell you that you are no longer capable of making the decision. Then give you a crown. That combination did not make every medieval king insane. It made every weakness at the top far more dangerous. And when a king truly did lose control of his own mind, the kingdom discovered just how much of its order had been resting inside it.